Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Last night, a majority of MPs voted in favour of the government's new Charter for Budget Responsibility. The Charter introduces new spending rules dictating that by 2020 the government would have to run a budget surplus. The rules would be in effect during so-called normal economic times. That is, when the economy is growing by 1% or more. But if you've heard just one thing about the Charter in the last few days, it's likely to have been Shadow Chancellor John McDonnell's flip-flop on the measure. First agreeing to support it, then saying his party would oppose it. Here's a taste of last night's exchanges at the dispatch box.
The truth is, running a deficit forever is not socialist compassion, it is economic cruelty, and Britain wants no more of it. The very purpose of this Charter is that we prepare for the future, reduce our debts and run a surplus in normal times, precisely so we do have the resources to help the poorest and the most vulnerable when economic bad times come. Of course, since the Shadow Chancellor spoke a couple of weeks ago, he has performed the most spectacular U-turn. And we were told when he got the job that he would be a divisive figure. I just didn't realise the split would be between two opposing views, both held by himself.
I suppose I should deal straightforwardly with the issue of the U-turn. Yes, 2 weeks ago I recommended that Labour MPs should vote for the Charter, and today I'll be urging them to vote against. Embarrassing. Embarrassing, 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 yes, of course it is. But a bit of humility amongst politicians never goes amiss. When the circumstances and judgments change, it's best to admit to it and change as well. It's difficult to take seriously the charters and mandates when time after time the Chancellor has come to Parliament to revise his own Charter. It's difficult to take it seriously when he's failed to meet his own targets consistently. I remember the promises. I was here. The Chancellor promised to wipe out the deficit in one Parliament. He didn't get through half. In 2010, he promised to reduce borrowing to £37 billion by 2014 to 2015. Last year, it was £87 billion, 135% more than forecast.
The Commons last night. Well, the vast majority of Labour MPs followed Mr McDonnell in opposing the Charter, but 21 abstained, and we're joined now by one of them, Chris Evans, and from the SNP conference in Aberdeen by Alex Neil, who's the Cabinet Secretary for Social Justice in the Scottish Government. Welcome to both of you. Chris Evans, why did you abstain?
Well, I think what I noticed on the doorsteps was people just didn't trust us in the economy. The reason they didn't trust us was we didn't have a consistent message. We didn't put ourselves over as economically competent, and I think it was extremely important that we give the public certainty, and that's why I opposed the
So why didn't you vote for it then?
I didn't vote for it because I believed there needed to be certain concessions, those being the protection of the NHS, the education budgets, the defence budget as well. Those weren't forthcoming. Now, had we been able to negotiate with the Chancellor, we may have been able to extract those concessions.
Right. I mean, there were also many people after the election who said that you lost because they couldn't distinguish you, the Labour Party, from the Conservatives. So by abstaining, aren't you just going to be lumped in with Conservatives for having made austerity permanent?
I think most of the people I spoke to were worried about the pound in their pocket and whether they could trust us with the economy. I believe at the end of the day, we've lost trust on the economy. It is imperative we regain that.
Right, but if terms of principle, hasn't it shown that John McDonnell has now got the right position? If, in the end, you are saying that trying to reach a budget surplus in all times isn't going to work, wouldn't it have been better to stood against this particular charter? It was a gimmick, And you fell for it.
There's never been a surplus under this government or the previous government anyway. A deficit is always wrong anyway, because every percentage point means there's less money spent on the NHS, the education, the Home Office budget, the defence budget as well. So I do believe we should be aspiring towards a surplus, but I think we have to put that caveat in. Conservative governments have never brought about a surplus.
Right. I mean, Alex Neil, voting against George Osborne's Charter for Budget Responsibility, they'll paint you as deficit deniers and undermine your claims that you want to cut the deficit responsibly.
Well, that's really a load of rubbish. We had the unemployment figures on Tuesday in Scotland, where we saw a rise in unemployment, and the economy is not completely out of the woods, and therefore it calls for anti-austerity measures to make sure that we increase employment, we reduce unemployment, and we don't put through people the special hell which will happen when they lose their tax credits, because as a result of these austerity measures that Osborne is following, more and more children in particular are going to be dejected into poverty, not just in Scotland, but throughout the whole of the UK.
Right,
that's
so all
too
your
high a price to pay.
Right, so all of Scotland's problems are the fault of the government at Westminster, nothing to do with the Scottish government?
No, I'm not saying that all the problems lie at Westminster, but they're in charge of the overall macroeconomic policy, they're in charge of taxation and overall spending, and our proposition is, and we put forward detailed proposals for an anti-austerity agenda that would still get us towards a balance, but over a longer period, and that would avoid all the human misery that's going to be caused by Osborne's measures.
So have you got no powers at all in the Scottish government to mitigate any of these things you say are causing so much harm in Scotland?
Well, we are mitigating them. For example, we have a welfare fund of well over £100 million a year to mitigate the impact of the welfare reforms that have taken place. But next year, the welfare reforms, or cuts, which is a more accurate description, will take £2.5 billion out of the welfare budget in Scotland and out of our economy.
Right.
We don't have £2.5 billion to mitigate all of those cuts.
Well, you could get it if you raise taxes, and you do have the power to do that.
No, we don't have the power at the moment to raise that level of taxation.
But you do have the power to raise income tax, don't you?
Powers. No, not yet. We won't have those powers until about 2017.
You have the power to raise income tax by 3p in the pound, up or down for that matter, which you haven't done up until now. But if you're complaining that there have been such severe cuts that are affecting the Scottish economy, why don't you raise taxes?
For a very simple reason. You've got to read the whole of the Scotland Act. We have the power to increase to increase income tax by 3p in the pound, but for every pound we raise, they take it back off us through the consolidated fund.
Right,
so
but
we
why
would
don't
be
you,
no better off.
But right, you were opposing cuts, but you say you want to be responsible with the economy. I still don't understand why you don't put your money where your mouth is and raise taxes.
Because under the current situation, for every pound we raise in income tax, a pound is taken off us through the consolidated fund.
Right.
That is a provision in the original Scotland Act.
So when do you want full fiscal autonomy?
Well, we want to be in charge of an entire fiscal, entire macroeconomic
possible.
policy at the earliest possible. Absolutely.
Yes.
And as I say, at the moment, we're only going to get control of about 30 or 40% of tax-raising powers in Scotland, and we won't get those until at least 2017.
Right, so you'd like it before then? You'd like full fiscal autonomy?
The quicker the better. The quicker the better. Anybody could run their economy better than George Osborne and David Cameron.
Right. I mean, there hasn't been that much of a rush to go for full fiscal autonomy since the price of oil has tanked. But I'll just stay with us for a little bit longer. Chris Evans, I mean, don't people like you prove the SNP's case when they say they are really the only proper opposition to this Conservative government, and they're unified on an anti-austerity platform?
It's the easiest thing in British politics is to oppose everything.
But it's true, isn't it?
But you can oppose everything you want to. The fact is that the Labour Party is not a protest movement. It is a government in waiting. That's how we should act, and we should act responsible, and we should bring about a constructive opposition. And that means when we see things like the Fiscal Charter, we should have a view on that, and a responsible view, I believe.
Do you actually want a Labour government with John McDonnell as Shadow Chancellor?
I want a Labour government, but I want a responsible government that people trust and will grow the economy.
Do you think they'd trust John McDonnell as Shadow Chancellor?
As long as he sticks with a consistent position. We have to be consistent about this.
Against fixed the fiscal charter?
No, what I would say is you cannot set a policy at party conference and then 2 weeks later change your mind. That confuses not only just the MPs but the general public as well.
How did you feel when you watched last night's exchanges, or you were there in last night's exchanges in the Commons with him saying embarrassing, embarrassing, embarrassing?
I felt it was totally needless. He didn't need to back himself into the corner. He should have stuck with his position. His position was 2 weeks ago to support the Charter. Then to turn it around, he backed himself totally into a corner. It was bad tactics and he didn't need to do it.
In terms of wanting to be a responsible opposition preparing for government, do you think your shadow City Minister, Richard Bergen, who gave an interview to Channel 4 News last night in which he said he hadn't fixed any meetings with anyone actually from the city, and he is the shadow City Minister, do you think he should get a move on?
I think we should be talking to people like hedge funds, city banks. We should be reaching out to everybody. Look, the Labour Party is nothing if it's not a national party. We lost the election in places like Reading, Swindon, where we need to take those seats back, and we need to speak to everybody and reach out beyond our base.
Right. I mean, Ian Martin, just finally, and we'll come back to Alex Neil before we move on. Listening to Alex Neil there saying that they still haven't got the levers, if you like, at their disposal to do anything to mitigate what they see as severe cuts. What do you say to that?
I'd say it's the easiest thing in the world. The nationalists love the constitutional argument and love to make everything about more powers, even though they're getting a lot more powers. I think in terms of the Labour Party, I think that analysis is absolutely right. And the optics from last night were catastrophic. I mean, most people are not as discerning as the viewers of the daily politics. Most people won't be paying attention to the fine detail. But at the top of the 10 o'clock news last night was the man who wants to be Chancellor of this country saying the word embarrassing 5 times while the House of Commons laughed at him. And that's the person that Labour is presenting to the country as the man they think can run the UK economy.
Right, just finally, Alex Neil, what do you say to Ian Martin's claims that you're always going to use that constitutional argument to, if you like, shirk your responsibility of running things in Scotland when you do have powers to do so?
Well, if you had listened to Nicola Sturgeon's speech this morning, you would see that Nicola emphasised the radical programme for government that we are going to introduce after the election next year, building on our existing achievements. Unlike the Labour Party that's an opposition that looks as though it's always going to be an opposition, we're a responsible government preparing for another 5 years of responsible government.
Alex Neil, thank you very much, and Chris Evans too.